Greetings and welcome to another action-packed episode of the Airport Communities Podcast. My name is J.C. Harris, and I am your host for today. And let's see, housekeeping. There's a lot going on. There is a new Des Moines Aviation Committee, which will be having their second, it's probably going to happen by the time you see this, their second meeting will be Monday. Unfortunately, they don't post their agendas too far ahead of time, but they apparently meet the second Monday of every month, so put that on your calendar. There's a Burien City Council meeting also on Monday where they're going to mention airport tree cutting at a local park, which will be part of this episode. Hopefully, members of the Burien Airport Committee will take a look at that as well when they meet, which tends to be the third Tuesday of every month at 6 p.m. On Tuesday, as if that weren't enough, the Port of Seattle Commission will meet at noon, and they are proposing to rename the South King County Community Impact Fund to the South King and Port Communities Fund or something like that. This is like the third or fourth rebranding because we care because it originally was called the Airport Communities Ecology Fund, and that's going to enter into this week's fabulous topic as well. Feedback. We got quite a bit of it regarding our last episode and many more downloads. I don't know if that's good or bad. Perhaps people always appreciate watching someone go bananas. Hey, there you go. There's your incentive if you haven't already seen episode 6. There's this thing in computer programming back in the dark ages when I got started called forward referencing. You could never do it. You could never talk about something in your code before really defining it in detail. You had to go through like 1,000 lines of explanation before you could actually get to doing a particular thing. Humans don't work that way. We like to be able to say, here's the thing, and I'll give you the details and the proof later. You could not do that when I got started. All of which is to say it's dangerous whenever we say something like, there's no second airport for you, but we have a upcoming episode on that. People should be skeptical about any forward referencing. This is about trust. However, the material is so dense, and we promised to keep these episodes to a reasonable length, and so we will continue to have to say, we have an upcoming episode on that, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. Regarding the HOK study, we did not want to leave the impression that the 1997 SeaTac Communities Impact Study, they're all have basically the same name, was any panacea. It had many flaws. One of its biggest flaws is that it was biased, maybe a third of it towards transportation impacts. And as I said last week, part of that was because the ACC, the cities fighting the third runway, had spent $1 million, in fact, more than that, on public relations and found that the only thing the public responded to was more traffic. So naturally, they put some emphasis in there, and also because traffic data is super easy to get. And if it's easy for engineers to get, it will tend to over-index in their reports. Just trust me on this one. But it also had really great work on long-term community impacts. And when we do an upcoming episode on that, we will drill into that quite a bit. I was also a bit harsh about STNI, the 2019 study. I would never want to imply that the individuals were anything but fantastic. I am sure they can do great work, but the study was terrible. It was a funny thing during the course of that year because they were quite clear about what the end product was going to be as they worked on it. If there is a villain It was the fact that the study budget was too small, and it was run by the state of Washington Department of Commerce. And I'm getting into trouble again. But the reason we push for independent consultants is that even though the cities were telegraphed very early on that the product is not going to be exactly what you'd hope, there was no way to influence, to change the direction or the approach midstream. In short, you can't yell at a government employee. We get these letters that would say, your feedback is really appreciated. We believe the Hoke was so much better, even with the shortcomings I mentioned, because the cities did have that direct line of communication. But to cut to the chase, we are advocating for a better version of the Hoke. We don't want to say, copy that. We want to say, here's the direction, but with some notable improvements, because we do have the ability to have lessons learned, even on the study. Also, you don't know what you don't know. In 1997, ultrafine particles, which are now recognized as being a major component of aviation emissions, were just being discovered in automobile exhaust. They certainly were not known to be a part of aviation, and there was no equipment to measure them in that context anywho. PFAS, the forever chemicals that were ubiquitous in airport firefighting for decades, were considered so safe that the firefighters would literally hose each other off for entertainment. Now we know that they are cancerous as hell. And turns out that SeaTac Airport contained 4 wells that were part of the regional water system. The hilltop is the source of several major creeks. So, maybe something we need to take a look at soon. We'll take a quick break and be back with the main topic. You might say that the interest in the SAMP a couple of years ago was everything to do with trees. Everybody loves trees, right? Around 2016, the Port of Seattle created this thing called the Flight Corridor Safety Program. Apparently, the FAA has these protocols to prevent obstructions to air traffic. They have all sorts of very specific policies in place for every imaginable situation, like bird deterrence, right down to how to keep ducks off a storm pond, because you don't want airplanes running into your average, goose or a Douglas fir. What was surprising was why all of a sudden, and also the number, 3,000 trees were to be evaluated. Now, the Flight Corridor Safety Program engendered a certain amount of very typical finger pointing between the port and the FAA. We've really tried to research where this started, but honestly, we can't find a direct order from the FAA that says, thou must do this, shalt do this. We've found various back and forths from port staff and the FAA talking about recommendations. So that created all this natural mistrust, like, whose idea was this? And why has it been okay for so many years, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, 3,000 trees are in play? In somewhat defense of the port, 3,000 was a bit overblown. They were evaluating all the trees according to a particular metric. The number to be cut was never going to be anywhere near that. But since then, it hasn't been exactly 0. And many of the trees that have been cut down have special significance. And it's very understandable when you don't have a transparent process, and especially when there have been so many thousands of other trees removed for projects like the Des Moines Creek Business Park and SR 509. So, as so often happens, the city of SeaTac was first to be alerted because, the airport is on their property. That's another story why they hear about things first. And a couple of their council members did start spreading the word, and pretty soon you had a wildfire of interest. An interesting thing, there was a community Facebook page in Des Moines on an issue having absolutely nothing to do with this, and all of a sudden one day it changed into being the Quiet Skies Puget Sound group. They developed a logo and made themselves about airport issues and done a great deal of good work. Their originating members ended up being on the original Des Moines Aviation Committee, the START, and the second airport stuff. So a significant amount of energy throughout the community about the SAMP seems to come down to trees. Now, to respond, a couple of port commissioners became engaged. John Creighton seems responsible for what was known as the Airport Community Ecology Fund, ACE, essentially a grant program for environmental remediation that could be taken advantage of by nonprofits around the airport cities for $1 million. Commissioner Fellman met with the Hillgrove Cemetery board people. That's something you may not know about. There is a historic cemetery that contains the remains of the original white settlers of the region, some going back to before the Civil War. It's along 200th, and the place had fallen into great disrepair. They worked out an agreement to rebuild the gates, the fencing was very nice, and to provide some form of perpetual care, which had been lacking. And in exchange, they agreed not to make a big stink out about the removal of 6 old-growth trees. Also, Forterra developed this thing called the Greener Cities Partnership. They conducted a tree inventory of all the surrounding cities. You can go online and see very pretty detailed maps of tree cover, tree canopy. They made presentations to all the surrounding cities. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the Burien online paper, the B-Town blog, about Matheson Park in Burien. And the same kind of thing is about to befall 5 old-growth trees in that park. And the Burien City Council, I'm sure will get complaints, as if it's totally out of the blue. But the port may disagree, because the program, the Flight Corridor Safety Program, has been on their site, theoretically, since 2016. It's hard to find. They've changed the name at least once and the web pages. But, the notion of managing these 3,000, actually, it's more like 2,888 trees, it's still there. What STNI did was make a GIS of every tree. And we hope that starting now, someone keeps an eye on that, because these trees are in play, and every time the port indicates it wants to, take one down, it indicates that. I used indicate twice, didn't I? People will still want to know why some trees are removed, why some others aren't, and also, is it a harbinger of something? We'll get to that. But as we've said a number of times, airports are the nimbiest of the NIMBY. People really don't get energized on any of this stuff until it's almost literally on their block. Even if it's public information, if nobody's monitoring, it will always look like it's just out of the blue. Hopefully, people involved with Matheson Park will look at what happened at Hillgrove and negotiate some kind of ongoing compensation. Hopefully something better, and not one time, something ongoing. We're going to stop here and say that we hate the word impacts, and we're going to have a future episode on that. We don't like the word because community planners use the word impact fee, and it does not mean the what I think you think it means. Isn't that what the guy says in that Princess Bride? Yeah. To a planner, an impact fee means a one-time payment. It's one of those casino deals. Maybe that's a bit harsh. Maybe it's better to call it more like insurance or a hedge. Environmental hedge, get it? Sorry. Both the developer and the city are making a bet. They do a study and they establish an impact fee. The city hopes it really recovers all the costs that they expect to incur from here to eternity, and the developer is paying one time so they never have to think about that again. Now, cutting down a tree, you can say, well, I'll replace it with 3, which is the typical mitigation. We don't think of that as something so easy to quantify. An old growth tree is not the same thing as like planting 3 new ones. One might argue that a truly majestic tree is more like a historic statue with perpetual value, and removing it changes the very nature of the park. And as such, something ongoing should be required. The rules on this stuff are very murky because the whole system is geared towards that one-time payment. In our previous episode, we defined the port as a county-wide agency. In the case of the third runway, when they acknowledged that 15 acres of wetlands needed to be mitigated when they were building the Great Wall of SeaTac, their solution? Create 15 new acres of wetlands. In Auburn, because the law said in that case, since their service area is King County, they could make up that deficiency anywhere. Get it? Under the law, not only is a tree usually just a tree, but it can also just as easily be a tree that gets replanted somewhere in Auburn. We think the discussion needs to be more like what happened at Hillgrove, only a lot better, because they had the one discussion and then, for all practical purposes, the group dissolved. It may not have been, this life-changing thing for cities, but that's the different way of thinking we all need to get our minds around. Something ongoing. When we change the feature of an area, we don't just make a one-time payment and hope for the best. The impact fee model simply doesn't work for airport impacts. People talk about economic partnerships a lot. They've never worked out so great for us. But by having an ongoing interest in places like Matheson Park or Hillgrove Cemetery, it kind of gives you an insight into a potentially better kind of partnership, one where the port recognizes the impacts by having ongoing skin in the game. Now, going back to Forterra, as I said, you can go to STNI and you can see detailed maps of tree canopy throughout Burien, Des Moines, SeaTac. For example, they said that Des Moines has 29% tree cover. But so what? I've heard local electeds say, wow, 29% is great. And I've seen other environmentalists say, no, the goal should be 40. This is like talking about the average person in America. We have no idea what is actually healthy for each neighborhood. And unfortunately, they provided no such context or a prescription. They just laid it out flat. That's another chronic problem with studies. The discussion should have led to, here are the things your city council needs to think about in terms of goals, means, and methods. Forterra just put the numbers out there and left it to the cities to decide whether 29% for an entire city is good, bad, or indifferent. The better discussion would have been for the port to open the door and say, all right, this is the inventory. Next, let's talk about what we should have to meet various climate targets, various community targets. You have the expertise in terms of arborists and all manner of environmental science. Put together the best practice recommendations for us and for yourself. We share the same airspace. We share a lot of land. We share a lot of economic interests, as you say. Let's talk about the other shared impacts in the broader context. That's not an abstraction. In 2023, the port started something called the Land Stewardship Plan, which sounded great on paper. As I just said, the port really does have great people in terms of all areas of environmental science. As an example, instead of the usual 3-to-1 tree replacement most cities do, it provided for a more stringent 4-to-1. And then, I gotta say, the commission really let itself down. That's how polite people say it when you've really screwed up. You let yourself down. The implementation is limited to the same area under consideration for the SAMP, meaning just the airfield. I don't know if you've taken an aerial view of the airport recently, you're flying in and out, but not too many trees near any airfield, dear boy. I mean, the whole point of the Flight Corridor Safety Program is to remove any of that from the flight path. The port could have published their land stewardship plan and applied it to all port-owned property, regardless of location. For example, the Des Moines Creek Business Park, Nera and Burien properties they've sold off or had covenants with adjacent to SR 509. And again, all of this could have been a shared discussion of impacts, and it could have acted as a model for improving the tree replacements and environmental remediations for surrounding cities. Now, at the end of the day, trees are a very small piece of the puzzle. And there's always a tendency towards a little bit of eye rolling. I can hear the eye rolling over the interwebs. People always want to go for the home runs. It's this, well, that doesn't help me with a noise, or that doesn't help me with the flights going over my house. That's not the point. They had a chance, they, the port itself, and the cities, to develop this ongoing relationship based on broader impacts. The Flight Corridor Safety Program and Forterra was that missed opportunity. But too often you'll go to any committee meeting and someone will say, well, if it isn't about noise or exhaust, that's not an airport issue. One sad thing about ACE is that it ended after allocating a little more than half of that $1 million. It got folded into another program and then another program. Frankly, not enough groups applied. There just aren't that many nonprofits near the airport that work on environmental issues. There should be, but there are not. It's really hard to set up a nonprofit. The port could do more simply by helping to stand up such groups. It doesn't. Or they could simply bypass the whole problem by opening up these programs to cities which already have specialists with a complete list of community needs. Also, the grants had a 3-to-1 match requirement, which sucks. We'll get into how much the port's grant system sucks in a future episode. I think that's forward reference number 7 for those keeping score. But for now, little by little, ACE has morphed into the South King County Fund, which broadened the grant to include, surprise, economic development and apprenticeships and small business. And this Tuesday, the port will again expand it to essentially all of King County and basically anything to do with airport communities, and the environmental impacts died a long time ago. They made it too damn hard, and your city councils did not encourage them to do any better. As usual, they started with a program that had potential but was, basically half-baked. And instead of the cities keeping their eye on the ball and getting to a fluffy brown, whatever the baking analogy is, Rev 2, you have the photo op with local electeds, and whatever good was in the original policy drifts away into that place where selfies go to die, along with half-baked goods. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. STNI's mission from the beginning has been everything around the airport has to do with the airport. The economy, the education, crime, roads, everything. If they are considered in any environmental planning document, NEPA, SEPA, that should be in play. If it gets evaluated, it should be negotiated. Ooh, I like that. You can be like Forterra, just lay it out flat, and then what? A one-time fee? or you can use it as a starting point for the conversation, which the airport communities began in 1976 with the Sea-Tac Communities Plan, but keep dropping every 4 or 5 years. Last year, the city of Des Moines had to spend $124 grand on bird deterrence, another FAA requirement. Why should any city have to pay for anything to do with airport operations? Large or small, these things add up, and every city around the airport has to deal with them. We feel bad for the Burien City Council because, again, this will seem like a surprise. It's only a surprise if nobody keeps these things front of mind when we're talking about airport impacts. And the funny thing is, Burien is the one city that actually took advantage of that Greener Cities partnership. They have an ongoing advisory group which has done some really great work trying to improve tree canopy, and except, well, they forgot about this. You get the irony, since it came directly out of the Flight Corridor Safety Program? You get it? It's the psychology. We can't seem to wrap our minds around what cumulative impacts even mean. We all say we want them, but they're just abstractions, even when they're smacking us in the face. It's important to think about capacity, sure. We have upcoming episodes. Flight paths, you bet. All these first order effects, noise and pollution, absolutely. But you also want to think about the second order effects. They're just as real, and oddly enough, they are often much easier to mitigate because you're not fighting about all of this FAA code all the damn time. And you're not distracted about, well, should we go to DC? They're just things the port can do anytime it wants as part of being a good neighbor. A better functioning START or any airport committee could fill a year's worth of agenda issues with things their city simply needs to keep on their radars. Things like trees and developing partnerships to mitigate the specific items. Sometimes people wonder why we post news items about the seaports. Well, first of all, because it's a major source of revenue for the port, which is unconstrained, hint, hint. But mainly, we do it because that's where the port's heart really is. If you watch carefully, they already do a lot of this voluntary stuff around the water because it's become a core value to protect and to enhance all aspects of the waterfront and marine life. Their roots are as a port. When I say port, you think the sea. Commissioner Felleman was something of a marine biologist. There is a tradition of port comms with import-export companies. Director Metric was a Coast Guard admiral. It's in the DNA. It's now just a question of saying, okay, apply those same values to the air, the land, and the water around SeaTac Airport. The moneymaker? Oh, and one last thing. It is not totally unrealistic for people who see tree removal in a spot that isn't underneath an obvious current flight path to wonder, what might that mean for future flight paths? It's always good to bear in mind that the FAA reserves the entire airspace for future use. As we'll keep saying, airport communities have always historically tended to be the worst kinds of NIMBYs. In previous expansions, people would act very smugly. Don't like it? Move! Regarding concerns by neighbors 12, 14 blocks away under a new proposed flight path. And then a year later come whining to a public meeting about how they had no idea it was going to go over their neighborhood. Everyone, including cities, somehow assume the flight paths in the airport remain static. Sometimes, but sometimes not. So even if you don't care too much about trees, maybe you should care a bit and, keep your eyes open, because if you see a tree coming down, you may not just be seeing a tree come down, you may be watching phase 1 of a future on-ramp to Railroad in the Sky. See, that was a backward reference, okay? That was good, because we've already talked about it.